Thank you, Mr. President. We all remember the very, very severe financial crisis of 2008, which precipitated a very severe recession from which we have had a very, very weak recovery. In many ways, we're still trying to recover from that. I want to talk a little bit about that, and I want to talk a little bit about the opportunity that is before us to make some really constructive changes to help us have a more robust recovery, the recovery we've been waiting for. But let's first review very briefly the causes of this financial crisis, because the misguided response to it has contributed to our lack of a robust recovery. The causes of the financial crisis were, of course, principally government causes. It was principally the failure of government policy that created the financial crisis that led to this recession. What specific government policies? I would say several, just briefly. First of all, it was failed monetary policy, a policy in which the monetary authorities kept interest rates too low for too long, actually had negative real interest rates, and that policy, quite predictably, created a bubble in residential real estate, the explosion of which led to this crisis. This was compounded by the failed legislative policy, which actually required mortgage lenders, especially the government-sponsored enterprises of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, required that they lend money to people who were very unlikely to be able to pay it back. It's generally a very bad idea to lend money to people who are not able to pay it back, and it was a bad idea in this case as well. And then thirdly, I would suggest that there was a failure of government regulators. There were many, many thousands of regulators crawling through all the financial institutions of America, but somehow this gigantic bubble escaped their notice. And the interconnected nature of the firms and the exposures that firms had to financial risk seemed to escape their attention. So this combination of a failed monetary policy, failed legislative policy, and failed regulatory policy was the government's enormous contribution to this crisis. Now, one of the things that this financial crisis revealed, I think to everybody could agree, that we learned just how inadequate the resolution mechanism that we had for the failure of a large, complex financial institution. We really didn't have an adequate one at all. The failure of Lehman Brothers was a good case in point. And the worry at the time was that if large financial institutions were simply allowed to fail, they would have a knock-on effect that would bring down the entire global financial network and beyond. So that was the concern, and I think it's valid that the resolution mechanism at the time was insufficient. So, in the wake of this crisis, Congress stepped in and decided we have to do something about it. And of course, what they did was they gave us Dodd-Frank, a law that is very badly flawed in many ways, in part because it failed, or at least the authors failed to fully comprehend the cause of this crisis, and because they took the wrong fundamental approach to dealing with it. Most fundamentally was a conceptual flaw, which is that future financial crises would be avoided by having the government impose enormous control, very extensive control, and not by freeing up market discipline to prevent the crisis from occurring. I think that is very much at the heart of the fundamental conceptual flaw of Dodd-Frank. Some of the specifics, broadly speaking, were to severely restrict what financial institutions could do, essentially turn medium and large-sized banks into public utilities, give the regulators, the same folks that missed the last crisis, virtually unlimited powers to micromanage these institutions with the thought that somehow in the future they'll catch the next one. And then as a fail-safe in Dodd-Frank, the sort of final backstop is to actually codify a category of financial institutions as too big to fail. The terminology they use in Dodd-Frank is a little different. They call them systemically important financial institutions. But that's what it is. It is carving into the law a category that we will then deem to be too big to fail. And the creation of an explicit bailout mechanism whereby taxpayers will have to once again bail out these financial institutions if they fail. Well, Mr. President, there are many, many problems with this whole approach, not the least of which is there should be no institution in America that's too big to fail. A private, for-profit organization, if it fails, it must be allowed to fail. There's no justification for forcing taxpayers to bail out any kind of firm, including banks. So that's a bad and fundamental flaw. But there's many adverse consequences that have come along. We've seen a huge concentration in banking assets directly in response to Dodd-Frank. That actually arguably concentrates risk. We've seen costs to consumers rise. Costs for financial services that consumers need have gone up. The liquidity in securities has gone down. That just means that pension funds and savers have to pay more to invest their savings in the stocks and bonds that they're relying on for their retirement security. Innovation has dried up because bureaucrats have to approve everything and anything that a financial institution can do. By the way, it actually destroyed a whole industry. This is not reported on nearly as much as I think it should be, but Dodd-Frank, together with the abnormally low interest rates we've had once again, it's completely ended the entire industry of startup community banking. In the United States, it's worth noting, in the United States of America, prior to the passage of Dodd-Frank, for decades, Americans launched new banks, something that business folks would do routinely. Handful of business people would get together, pool their resources, start up a bank, contribute the capital, do their own banking business there, and then what would they do? They would provide lending services to consumers and small businesses in their towns, in their communities, to the local pizza shop that needs to add a walk-in cooler in the back, to the local HVAC repair shop that needs to buy another pickup truck. It's community banks that provide the lending for these kinds of small business opportunities that allow families and individuals to live their dream and create jobs all across America. Community banks for years. Well, prior to Dodd-Frank, for decades, we launched on average about 125 new community banks per year. Many more in really good times, fewer in bad times, but about 125 per year. From the day that they signed Dodd-Frank into law in July of 2010 through this afternoon, we've launched 2 new community banks in America. 2 in over 6 years. This industry's done. It's dead. It doesn't happen anymore because when business folks sit around the table and say, gee, wouldn't it be a good idea to launch a bank because we need one in our community. We don't have a small community bank that's willing to provide these loans. What they discover very quickly is they can't possibly make a go at it because the regulatory expense and cost is so staggering that they can't see their way to a surviving business model. So we don't have these community banks anymore. They're not being launched, haven't been for years. And who knows how many small businesses haven't been launched and haven't been able to grow because people could never get the funding. Let me just promise you, Citigroup's not in the business of doing the kind of lending that new community banks do every single day. So this is just one of the many problems. And one of the most fundamental ones is that taxpayers have this big contingent liability hanging over their head in the form of that bailout mechanism that I alluded to earlier. This requirement that they will be forced to bail out big financial institutions all over again. Dodd-Frank codifies it. Dodd-Frank spells out exactly how it should happen. So, Mr. President, it is my strongly held view that we need to reform Dodd-Frank. It's overdue, but it needs substantial reforms. Those reforms should include making sure that taxpayers never have to bail out another giant institution. It's just wrong. That should not be on the table. In fact, it should be precluded. A second thing is that taxpayers should not be forced through the mechanisms of this bill to make banking products more expensive for consumers, less available, more expensive, fewer products and services. We can do this while we maintain our ability to deter and detect and prevent and prosecute fraud when it occurs. That absolutely is a fundamental responsibility that we have, and we can do that. But most importantly, we've got to enable a vigorous competitive market for financial services to respond to consumers with new services and new products at ever lower costs, and to have a market discipline that forces those institutions to behave prudently because their future depends on it. Now, we're coming into a new Congress soon, Mr. President, and I am hoping that our Democratic colleagues will work with us. Will work with us to correct the fundamental flaws in Dodd-Frank, to repeal the things that don't work, to roll back the problems with this legislation. But the incoming Senate Minority Leader is on record in interviews already declaring that they will not do so, that they will not help us in this endeavor. They're not interested, that they can deny us the 60 votes that we will need to make substantive reforms to Dodd-Frank. Well, let me suggest to my colleagues that first of all, I hope there's a change of heart on the other side. I hope, first and foremost, that as we go through this process, that some of our Democratic colleagues will work with us and will agree that there are changes that need to be made and that we can make them, hopefully with a very broad consensus. But if that's not possible, I would suggest there is an alternative. And the alternative is that we use a budget resolution that would contain reconciliation instructions to the Banking Committee, and for that matter, this could apply to other authorizing committees, but I'm referring specifically to the Banking Committee. And the reason that that's important is because that will allow us to pass subsequent legislation in compliance with the reconciliation instructions that can pass the Senate with a simple majority vote. That's not my preferred way to do it, but we've got to do this. We've got to get this done. This changing Dodd-Frank will have a very profound impact on our economy. It'll enable us to have growth that we've been waiting too long for. And this device might be what we need to get there. Let me point out that there are precedents for this. The Deficit Reduction Act of 2005 used a budget resolution to create reconciliation instructions, which in turn switched some of the FHA funding streams from mandatory spending to discretionary spending, from spending that's on autopilot to spending that's at the annual discretion of Congress. That was done through exactly this mechanism. FDIC and the NCUA, these are deposit insurance funds. They were restructured, they were reformed, and they were done under the same device, using the same procedural mechanism. So those changes were possible because they had very significant budgetary impact. And that is one of the criteria for using the reconciliation device. In these cases, it was something on the order of a couple of $2 billion worth of taxpayer savings over 10 years. Well, Mr. President, reforming Dodd-Frank can save taxpayers a lot of money. The CFPB alone, over 10 years, is expected to consume, on its current path, over $6 billion. That's a lot of money. Some really sensible, thorough reforms there could save taxpayers enormously. The Orderly Liquidation Fund. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that that's going to cost taxpayers $20 billion over the next 10 years. $20 billion, by the way, of bailout money. We can fix that. The Office of Financial Research, over $1 billion. So, Mr. President, there are many cases in which we can save serious taxpayer money, in the process reduce our deficits, thereby achieve the goal of the reconciliation instructions given to the Banking Committee, and along the way, help encourage stronger economic growth by modifying some of these misguided policies in Dodd-Frank. Mr. President, I would suggest that the election that we just went through was about several things, but one of them certainly was shaking up the status quo and getting some things done, and not just continuing doing what we've always been doing. Well, for too long now, we've been putting up with the Dodd-Frank bill that is costing us a lot of economic growth and opportunity. I am hoping that our Democratic colleagues will work with us so that we can begin to make the constructive changes that we need. But if not, I think we should use all tools available to get this job done. And I suggest the absence of a quorum.